this session, another Meet the Ambassadors session, we talked to 3 Australian diplomats from around the African continent. We are joined by Alison Chartres, High Commissioner in Nairobi. Alison, thanks for joining us.
Welcome.
We're also joined by Kate O'Shaughnessy, High Commissioner in Port Louis, Mauritius. Thank you, Kate.
Thanks, Dom.
And we're also joined by Ian Halliday of Austrade, Consul General in Dubai and General Manager for Middle East, Africa. Thank you, Ian, for joining us.
Hi, Dominic, and thanks very much for the opportunity.
Alison, can I start with you, please? You're coming towards the end of your posting in Kenya and non-resident status in a number of countries. We often, in the West, look for signs of progress in African countries, progress from an economic point of view and developmental point of view. As you come to the end of your posting there, are we seeing signs in Kenya of progress along them lines?
Thanks, Dominic. And yes, it's sad to be coming to the end of 3 amazing years here in Kenya and this part of Eastern Africa. But look, I'm pleased to say that I'm leaving this post. There is a very bright future, obviously, for Kenya and other countries in the region. But that's obviously notwithstanding some enormous challenges. And in this case, I'll focus on Kenya, of course, not just the COVID-19 pandemic, obviously, countries around the world experiencing the same difficulties, and that's obviously caused huge issues for economic and development progress, and in some cases wound some of that progress back or at least halted it. But in Kenya's case, it's also, of course, had the locust invasion, along with some of the other countries in the region, of course, but Kenya has been hard hit by that, particularly in the northern areas, and also severe weather events. So particularly flooding in the last 12 months has also taken its toll. So I remain ever optimistic. I think there are some really strong foundations still here in Kenya for continuing to see strong economic growth once everyone can get through the COVID-19 challenges, of course, and get back onto the positive trajectory. Obviously, the forecasts of economic growth have been wound right back, as they have for other countries across the world. We were seeing prior to COVID-19, of course, economic figures growth of 5-6%, and that was really, really welcome news. There's been obviously some really important measures taken with the Big Four development agenda here in Kenya, some really important steps to encourage foreign investment and economic activity and private growth. But obviously Kenya, like others, is also in need of revenue, and more so now than ever. So some of those aspects of sort of doing business here as well have changed through this year. But overall, if I look back at my 3 years, notwithstanding the challenges this year, a very steady and positive growth forward with a very strong entrepreneurial backbone of this country that I think stands it in good stead for the future.
Yes, I've met many Kenyan Australians, and the entrepreneurial background is certainly strong right through the Kenyan community here in Western Australia. Kate, can I turn to you now, because you're at the opposite end of your posting there in Port Louis and Mauritius. You've only just begun your posting there. What are your hopes and your aims and your goals for your period there in Mauritius?
Thanks, Dominic, for a really good question. And it's a question that has a different answer today to what it does as I was considering taking up this role when I was advised of it late last year. And I think that goes to the core, actually, of how Australian diplomatic missions are finding that they have to change in their operations. So if I think about 3 top priorities for me, 2 of them really don't relate to the private sector or indeed to the way I thought about the commencement of my role. The first is consular services. That remains a top priority for all of us. The second is more of a regional focus about working with our partners on Australia's multilateral interests and making sure we support a stable and prosperous region, which in a bigger picture perspective supports our private sector interests. And then the third is really focused, and this comes from the challenges caused by COVID for Mauritius, and it's around education. So Mauritius is a tourism economy. It wanted to set itself up as what it likes to call a gateway to Africa, especially for financial services. There's a few challenges to that now because of travel restrictions, the requirement for a 2-week quarantine coming into Mauritius, the challenges that they're facing because they've been placed on the Financial Action Task Force grey list. The government is working on addressing those issues that have been raised by the task force, but it does mean that some of the elements of Mauritius that formerly it would promote as attractive to Australian mining companies to set up business here are a little bit on pause. So we see in this context, with all of those pressures that Mauritius is facing, education is the biggest area of opportunity and the one that I think with the team we'll be able to make the most use of. What really I guess is of interest to your mining cohort is that while Mauritius at the moment attracts around 3,000 international students a year, it has a longer term goal of attracting up to 100,000, particularly from the African subcontinent. From the African continent, we're not in India. And I think, in terms of what they can do to support building skills in the mining sector, that is potentially an area of really interesting synergy between Australia, Mauritius and Africa, and one of the most possibility, I think, in the current context.
Great. Thanks, Kate. Ian, can I ask you, as Kate mentioned there, the dynamics of international trade have changed dramatically in the last 9 months. But looking longer term and more widely, how is Australia's trade relationship with Africa, and particularly the way that Austrade looks at Africa and its engagement and our engagement with Africa, how has that developed over the last decade?
Yeah, thanks, Dominic. It's a good question, and I think we're still optimistic about Africa. And look, Alison and Kate talked about some of the challenges, but I certainly am quite bullish about Africa in the medium to longer term. And yes, COVID's just thrown up another set of challenges. We know some countries have certainly got some economic difficulties, but we're working very closely with our DFAT colleagues, the ambassadors, high commissioners, also with other key partners like Paydirt, and I think full credit to Paydirt for putting on ADU again in a challenging environment. Australian Africa Chamber of Commerce is another key partner. Part of our challenge is, I think we all recognise, is just the cultural literacy of Africa by many Australians, and conversely by many Africans of Australia. And so anything we can do to help try to promote the opportunities to help then drive, improve, increase trade and investment, I think we've all got the passion to do that. And I think we are seeing industry diversification in Africa as areas of opportunity apart from the traditional mining and mets. Kate talked about education. I think I also share Kate's sort of positive story about education, which has really taken a big hit this year, but it's about transnational education and vocational education on the ground in Africa to help build capability. And then we'd also say areas around energy, water, food security, future cities, intra-Africa infrastructure, and the digital economy and health are all sectors that we see potential growth in. And then we're also seeing, I think COVID has also thrown up to many Australian organisations the risk of looking at just a few small markets. And so we've now, in the last 3 or 4 months, had about 40 Australian organisations who are looking to go to Africa. And so we're pretty buoyed by exporters out of Australia who are looking for market diversification. So we're doing quite a bit of work with those particular companies. We're looking at local partnerships in Africa as well to help try and identify opportunities, because it is very much you need local partners on the ground to help realise those opportunities. And then more particular in Nigeria, just recently we've appointed a local organisation to assist Australian companies. So we've had a High Commission in Abuja, but we've never really had a strong presence in Lagos, and so we've appointed a local organisation to assist organisations if they're interested in looking at Nigeria's opportunities. So, we're bullish but also realistic about Africa, and we do think in the medium to longer term there's plenty of opportunity across a whole range of various sectors.
Thanks, Ian. And obviously the demographic narrative is so compelling, particularly in a country like Nigeria that's projected to have one of the world's largest economies in the next decade, that Australia needs to be involved in that particular economy and take advantage of the partnerships that we can generate. Alison, can I turn to you again? We spoke briefly about Kenya and the economic situation in Kenya, but you're also non-resident High Commissioner to Tanzania, which obviously has an incredibly close relationship in the resources sector to Australia. There's lots of Australian companies active in Tanzania. It's a slightly difficult situation we find ourselves in, given that we're in the midst of a presidential election as we speak in Tanzania. But there was a rather dramatic shift in minerals policy and a new mining act and legislation that came into Tanzania a couple of years ago, which essentially put a freeze on the industry for a period. Can I ask you to give us an update on where the industry finds itself, where Australian companies find themselves in regards to that Minerals Act?
Thanks, Dominic. Yeah, it is obviously an interesting time for us as obviously and we will obviously engage going forward with the Tanzanian government and noting, as you say, the very strong interest of Australian companies in Tanzania in that mining sector. There has, since obviously I've been in the region for 3 years. I started at the time when the legislation and the regulations had been updated and changed. And obviously, yes, as you say, there was a stalling of some company investments, and obviously there was the issue with Barrick Acacia that needed to be worked through by the Tanzanian government and those companies. We've actually seen in the last 12 months, I think, some movement on this, and it's very obviously welcome news that Barrick has found a way forward with the Tanzanian government, and I think that has been a real game changer for the sector and for obviously for our companies. I think that should herald a sign of optimism going forward. Having said that, of course, there are challenges in different jurisdictions where foreign investors seek to operate. I think with Tanzania, you need to develop those very good relationships with the government, work through what your interests are, where they are, how you'll obviously contribute to the Tanzanian economy and development in terms of obviously keeping very high local content and meeting the new regulations that came out, as you said, 2 to 3 years ago. So I think patience is definitely needed because the government obviously deliberates very carefully with each sort of license application and each company that seeks to progress their investments. But yeah, it's there are still areas where we and Australian companies will wish to continue to engage with the Tanzanian government to seek some more clarity and some more progress to really allow those Australian investments and other foreign investments to progress. But yeah, let's see through this election period and out the other end, see how that dialogue can go forward to try and resolve some of those outstanding issues. But I certainly have seen improvements in the time that I've been here in terms of dialogue and feedback from the government.
Alison, has mining been and foreign investment been a major election issue during this presidential campaign in Tanzania?
I think overall, obviously the government of Tanzania in the lead up to the election was very keen to profile how changes in Tanzania were benefiting the Tanzanian people, quite rightly. They need to see the benefits of foreign investment. Of course, there was data coming out that showed there was actually recently some increases in mining revenue coming through, which was obviously a good signal in that vein. But look, there are a lot of issues involved in an election and campaigning. Ultimately, the people of Tanzania, understandably, and the political parties campaigning were very focused on what does it mean for the Tanzanian people, how are their lives going to change for the better. So the focus obviously on agriculture and infrastructure, transport, how people can move more readily from A to B, access health, all of those have come into play. But obviously revenue from foreign investment has played some part in the election.
Thanks, Alison. Kate, in Mauritius, the situation is very different. It's not a mining country per se, but the government has been very assertive in promoting itself, as you mentioned earlier, as a financial services hub and a gateway to Africa in many ways. But it strikes me that with the international push for greater transparency and publish what you pay and movements like this, that perhaps the situation in Mauritius is a little bit more complex and nuanced than perhaps it needn't be. What's your advice to Australian companies who are perhaps considering Mauritius as a destination to base themselves as a gateway to Africa?
So it's an excellent question, Dominic, and really it's a question. I think it would genuinely be a question for Australian companies, I think, to think about whether right now is the right time or whether it's better to give the government here the year that they're going to need to work through those allegations. Obviously, that's a commercial decision, and I don't make a comment about individual companies' decisions. And there is over 150 Australian companies that have decided to headquarter themselves here under Mauritian arrangements. And I think the principle is a really good one, and Mauritius has really good regulations in general. It's a well-functioning government and society, and it does make sense to set yourself up here in terms of working across into Africa. The challenge is that I think in the financial regulation space, there has been a few slip-ups. There is no sugarcoating it. The Financial Action Task Force has put Mauritius on its grey list, and the European Union has put Mauritius on its blacklist. Now, to give full credence to the Mauritian government, they're taking this very seriously. There's a number of experts from around the world that are here working with the government to help them set up the right regulations that can ensure there's greater transparency around funds that are coming into the financial institutions here. So I don't think that this is an insurmountable problem that can't be worked through, but I think your question about decisions that Australian companies make about setting up here, it's one that each company has to ask themselves. And it may be that a little bit of a lag is a good thing, and that gives everyone time to work through the process that need to be worked through.
Thanks, Kate. Ian, I'm going to ask you again. You mentioned nets earlier as obviously a huge part of Australia's trade relationship with Africa and right throughout the continent, in fact. Is it still a priority for our engagement with the continent?
Absolutely, Dominic. As most of the audience in today's webinar would know, that Africa holds nearly 30% of the world's mineral deposits. And given the level of industry development across the continent and Australia's expertise in the sector, nets has been and will continue to be a priority sector for the work done across the region. So absolutely still a priority. Just some recent information that we extracted also, we found there's something like 132 ASX listed companies in Africa operating over 450 mines in various stages of development. And that's from exploration to operation and across 34 countries. So, and we also know there's between 160 to 170 METS companies operating across 39 countries. So it's such a large footprint. It's always going to be a big focus for us. And our work in the sector primarily focused in Southern Africa, West Africa, and some jurisdictions in East Africa, such as Tanzania and Kenya. But in addition, we're now looking at what we can do to help industry develop in Nigeria. So it's, as I said, it's going to continue. It always has been, and it will continue to be a priority sector for us. And you know, just some of those stats just amplifies that further, that it's so important for all of us, and particularly with the fact that we've got such wonderful know-how and capability from an Australian perspective. We think we've got real opportunities to help Africa in the mining sector.
Thanks, Ian. I'm going to stay with you now because you mentioned education earlier, just as Kate mentioned education as well as a real growth sector for Australian African trade and relations in general. It strikes me that probably mining education is a great place to start in cross-pollinating between sectors. Can you tell us a little bit about Australia's education relationship with Africa?
Yeah, look, it's very strong. And look, Kate's really in the part of the epicenter, I suppose, from a Mauritius perspective, because there are a number of Australian universities that have set themselves up in partnership in Mauritius. And that's really to offer what they call transnational education and that's offering Australian curriculum in Africa for Africans. And I think that's going to continue over time, particularly as we've sort of coming through COVID and the inability for people to travel. So I think also COVID presented an opportunity around e-learning. And I think when we know the digital penetration in Africa is very strong, particularly in the younger cohort, we think may not be short-term the opportunity for direct student recruitment, but e-learning, transnational education, vocational education. And it's a good point you raise in respect of the mining sector. I think there are very big opportunities for miners and METS companies to help develop their workforces with Australian know-how and capability around vocational education. When I was in Mauritius mid last year, and I was talking to the Minister for Education, and she quoted that right now there's something like 200 million people who are in that 15 to 24 age demographic. And she said in the next 20 to 30 years, that number is going to go to 800 million people. And so if we want economic prosperity for Africa, if we want to realise the opportunities around trade and investment, we think there's opportunity for Australian education providers across the whole spectrum, whether that's tertiary education, school education, or vocational. So we're pretty buoyed by it, and we are seeing more Australian education providers show an interest in Africa, and we'd only be too happy with all our key partners to see what we can do to help both locals in Africa develop their own capability with their population base, but also support Australian education institutions. We think that's one of the biggest sector opportunities that presents itself both now and well into the future from an African perspective.
Thanks, Ian. Alison, does that resonate? Ian's comments resonate with you and your experience in Eastern Africa?
Yeah, absolutely. The education are strong in so many respects, and there is certainly a huge appetite. I found in the time I've been here to only strengthen and deepen those links. And even speaking to some of the education agents here in Nairobi just about a month or so ago, and their experiences even through this year, they still said there's so much demand still by Kenyans to travel to Australia and take up education opportunities. And I think, as Ian has said, it needs to be the whole spectrum as well, whether it's investment here or education opportunities in Australia. It needs to be across the range of spectrum, including technical and vocational education, which I think is also so critical for future job growth and economic growth in these countries. But it's ripe for further growth.
Alison, that leads me on to another question I wanted to ask you regarding Australian mining interests in Tanzania in particular. You mentioned earlier on the government incentives, requirements around localisation and around giving local employment opportunities, local content opportunities. Does that feed in to the education part and vocational training in particular? what's your advice to Australian companies investing in Tanzania? Is that a vital part of making themselves good corporate citizens in a country like Tanzania?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I do believe it is. And one of the things that I think Australian companies really do bring to the table is a high level of integrity and that sort of corporate social responsibility and shared value. I think is often how companies seek to explain it, and that's something certainly that companies seeking to invest or currently investing in Tanzania in the mining sector, for instance, certainly I think are seized of. And I would definitely strongly encourage those who are looking to Tanzania to take that part of their investment story extremely seriously. The Tanzanian government will be very receptive, of course, to ideas that companies bring that can only further develop the human capital. So the skills and education, particularly in technical and vocational education. So I really think that is such an important part of any foreign investment in Tanzania and elsewhere in Africa, but definitely something companies need to invest time in and find ways that they can really contribute to that and grow their workforce.
And obviously, just over the border where you are in Kenya, we've got a great example in Base Resources and the work that it's done in Kwale County around its Kwale Mineral Sands project as a promoter of local content and local employment.
Absolutely. Base Titanium, obviously, is a subsidiary of Base Resources, has in many ways sort of setting the gold standard really for how companies should operate. Mining companies or any company operating in another sector, the way they approach that investment in young people, train up young geologists, provide, the vocational training and engage with the communities and the local political actors as well. That's all part of obviously being able to operate effectively and leave a very strong, sustainable footprint at the end of the day.
Kate, can I just come back to you now and ask how the pandemic has affected the Mauritius economy and whether the government has laid out a recovery plan?
So it won't be a surprise to you, Dominic, for me to say that it's been devastating for the Mauritian economy. They're around 25% of their economy is dependent on tourism. Around 100,000 of Mauritius's 1 million people are employed directly in the tourism sector. So that's been an enormous blow to them. Mauritius is pretty agile in terms of adapting to challenges. You'll probably be aware in the 60s they were a sugar-based, single commodity economy, and they really diversified through the 90s and have become known as a bit of an economic miracle. And so there's some really hard thinking going on in government circles right now about how can they COVID-proof their economy? And they're looking, obviously, they want tourism to remain part of the economy, but they're looking at expanding and diversifying. They've laid out a plan in their budget, which was just handed down a few months ago. And sectors that may be of interest to Australian companies include public infrastructure programs, a goal to have 40% solar energy by 2030 or solar or renewable energy, a commitment to establishing a circular economy, investing in manufacturing and looking to increase their own food security. Mauritius, as an Indian Ocean island state, is really dependent on food imports. And if nothing else, this pandemic really that they don't expect to be completely food secure, but they did want to increase that a little. And I think that offers opportunities to Australian companies as well in terms of engagement on the agribusiness side. So, I think it's challenging times ahead, but the government is aware of those challenges, has a plan and is thinking about how to confront them, and that there's opportunities there for Australian companies and organisations to work with them as they confront those challenges.
Thanks, Kate. Alison, in Kenya, obviously much of its trade relies upon its trade with Europe and so forth. Has it been greatly impacted by COVID, and is there a recovery plan in place?
Yeah, thanks, Dominic. Yes. those questions you ask. So earlier on in the year, there was certainly, Kenya certainly felt the impact of the, obviously, cancellations of, they closed the airspace, so flights were cancelled. That obviously impacted not just passenger traffic and obviously tourism as well, but also, as you say, trade, and they do a lot of trade with European countries. But it wasn't long before Kenya Airways and other airlines realised that they needed to keep the trade going, and obviously air freight was able to continue through the closure of the airport to passenger flights. So, in the usual entrepreneurial, ingenious spirit here in Kenya, like some other places in the world, they refurbished the aircraft and got some of that, that produce out again to Europe, and the trade had, of course, taken a, but was sort of getting back on track. And I wouldn't say it's back to normal by any means now, but the European markets are still open now to Kenya, and that's a really good thing. So, yes, the government has a plan. It obviously has to look across multi-sectors and multifaceted approach to its recovery. One of the things I will say is that, like any crisis, people do see opportunity, and one of the things the government has been wanting to do over the last few years is really boost up the local Kenyan manufacturing and value addition. And what became apparent clearly to Kenya, as it did with other countries, is that they were very reliant on imports. They already knew that, but obviously COVID-19 brought that into greater stark relief. So some of the companies in the country were encouraged by the government to pivot and change direction, and of course manufacture local PPE, and so it's really generated again sort of innovation and thinking outside of the box by companies with the strong encouragement by government here, definitely.
Thanks, Alison. Ian, can I ask you, has COVID and the pandemic obviously set back Australia's trade and investment opportunities with every country in the world, but relatively with Africa, has it set it back further than it has with other regions, or could there be opportunity that comes out of it?
A bit like what Alison was saying, I think, Dominic, in the sense that, and as you just commented, I think every region suffered as a result of COVID. It's been a challenging time, whether it's been people movement, supply chain disruption, logistics, and I know a lot of mining mets companies have had challenges in getting people in and getting people out. And but look, the mining met sector is pretty resilient, and I think I understand that most operations are operating now. The one sector that really has been hit very hard is international education, and that doesn't matter where it is from around the world. So it's a very big part of the economy in Australia, but that has also given rise to digital learning. And so anything, someone told me about 3 months ago, anything that was sort of trending upwards in the last 6 to 12 months is just now is rocketing away, and anything to do with digital, same. And so we do think there's going to be opportunities of providing different ways of education from a digital means perspective. Still keen around direct student recruitment and transnational education, but probably I think there's going to be different means of provision of education into the future. And as I mentioned earlier on, we are seeing companies from Australia looking at market diversification. And so whether they're looking at the US or Europe or Africa and the Middle East, and it's across a range of sectors, and that's including mining and mets, but also in the area of health, telehealth, for example. We've also, both Kate and Alison talked about food security, and across the whole Middle East Africa region, where you do get a lot of foodstuffs imported. I think it has now amplified amongst many governments that they've got to do more about moving away from this reliance on import and or improving their own local production. And I think that's where Australian businesses, agribusinesses, can certainly assist in Africa. And how do they help local production being more productive? And that could be through better water management. And we know we've already got some Australian companies assisting in some African countries on improving water management efficiency. So I think for all the challenges that COVID's thrown up, I think there's also plenty of opportunities that people are starting to identify and realise. And what Alison and Kate and the DFAT and the Austrade team are here to do is to help those organisations, one, identify the opportunity, and then how do we help navigate through the process to realise those opportunities across a range of different sectors.
Ian, thank you very much, and I think that's a fantastically positive note to end on. Unfortunately, we've run out of time for this session. What I would usually say about this time is that I'm sure you can talk to delegates, or delegates can approach you during the drinks at the end of the day's proceedings. Unfortunately, they won't be able to do that this year because you can't join us in person in Perth. And many of our delegates, in fact, are having to do this remotely as well. But I'd like to thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and best of luck. And I'm sure if any of our delegates, whether in Australia or in Africa or internationally, would like to follow up the conversation, I'm sure they can make contact with you, Kate, in Port Louis, or you, Ian, in Dubai, or any of the team in Africa, and Alison with your team. Unfortunately, you probably won't be there by the time somebody does make contact with you, but your successor and the rest of the team will be there. And I encourage everybody to make contact with you. And thank you very much again for joining us today, and the best of luck.
Hello, thank you to our heads of mission and to Ian Halliday in Dubai for a fascinating discussion. We really enjoyed it. I believe we have a number of our heads of mission on the line with us, because we have got a number of questions. So I'm seeing the names. Hopefully we have the people with us. Gregory Andrews, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, hello. Hi, Commissioner. Hi, Commissioner Andrews.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us. I know you've been I've been following you on Twitter this week, and I know you've been on lockdown yourself. So thank you for joining us from Accra.
It's a pleasure.
Hi, Commissioner Kate O'Shaughnessy in Port Louis. Thank you for joining us again. Hi, Commissioner Alison Chartres in Nairobi. Thank you, Nairobi calling. Thank you.
Pleasure.
In one of your last, it must be one of your last official functions.
Week today I leave, so yeah.
And General Manager for Middle East and Africa for Austrade, Ian Halliday. Ian, hopefully you're there as well.
I'm here, Dominic. I'm just having trouble with my video at the moment. So.
No, fantastic. You qualify as the best audio of everybody, so thank you very much. We've got a couple of questions. There's actually not many people in the room, so I'm not going to kid you that you're speaking to a 500-person audience. But I do know for a fact that there's at least 400 people on the call. Many on the live stream. Many of them in Africa, and African diplomats, African delegates. Gregory, can I start with you? It's obviously a tumultuous week in geopolitics around the world. But can I ask, how does Australia's relationship with the countries that you are representative of in West Africa there, how does the shifting geopolitical situation, particularly around the US election, how does that affect Australian Ghanaian relations and wider relations?
Yeah, look, I don't think the US election actually has any direct immediate impact on Australia's interests here in West Africa. Australia's interests in West Africa are a West Africa that's secure and prosperous. And one of the things that I've noticed and that I think is really important, and Lisa Charland was talking about security earlier on today, but last year we facilitated here, Andrew Barnes, my predecessor, facilitated a mining and security conference, which is really about how can we maximise security for mining in the region. But the other thing that I've noticed is that mining creates a really big incentive, and Australian mining can contribute to security in the region. And as an example, here in Ghana alone, illegal gold mining, which they call galamsey, not only severely damages the environment, but the gold and the revenues from the gold are actually stolen from Ghana and channeled by terrorist groups, often out of the country. And so illegal gold mining can finance insecurity. And the alternative is high quality, professional, high environmental standard and high community standard partnerships with Australian companies. So, look, I'd say there aren't any direct impacts of the US election. Of course, at the moment, Cote d'Ivoire is facing some questions and security and stability concerns in relation to its recent election. And so Australia, along with other partners in the region, including Ghana, as the leader of ECOWAS, have been calling for calm and respect for the Constitution and human rights and stability.
Thanks, Gregory. I'm joined by my colleague, Paydirt Deputy Editor Mark Andrews, who was at the very first West African security mining security mission in Accra there. Mark, you had a question for Gregory?
Hello there, and hello to all the participants. Thanks very, very much for joining us. Yes, Gregory, it's speaking to Andrew Barnes, your predecessor, as you mentioned on various occasions about the security situation across West Africa, and you know, he's unfortunately saw a great deterioration in that situation during his tenure. Do you see that as your greatest challenge in your position?
The security environment is definitely deteriorating, and look, unfortunately, the wins that the world has been making against Al Qaeda further northeast of here in the Middle East have actually created a bit challenges. That the challenges that we're seeing here, in effect, are partly a product of the wins that we've had elsewhere, and also a product of weak governance and implementation of the rule of law north of here. Yeah, look, it's a real concern, and the extra efforts in Mali are also pushing some of the extremists further east and further south, and so that's creating pressures, more pressures in Burkina Faso, one of the poorest countries in the world, and then obviously that can leak down further to Ghana. At this stage, I think the security situation in Ghana is quite stable. I was within about 30 kilometres of the border of Burkina Faso a couple of weeks ago, and the government of Ghana is investing a lot in anti-terrorism, and so is Australia. We're doing simple things like funding through our aid program, youth diversion activities in the north of Ghana, provide a viable alternative for young people who would otherwise be at risk, according to their parents, of getting engaged in violent extremism. So it's something we need to watch closely. And like as I said a minute ago, I think Australian mining companies not only need security, but can contribute to security, because where you have an effective mine operating in a region, the opportunity cost of unrest is a lot higher. When you see employment being created, schools being built, roads being fixed, and the associated economic activities associated with a mine and the revenue streams for the government, that creates a really strong incentive to maintain security. So mining not only need security, but security is reinforced by mining.
Great. And Gregory, the West African Security Conference was such a success, and all sectors, all sections of the Australian mining community in West Africa banded together and for what was turning into an annual event. What lines of communication sort of remain open, and the connectivity? Have you managed to sort of sustain that during the COVID period?
Yeah, so look, there's been a lot of on-the-ground activity here, and once we're through COVID, I can't see any reason why we wouldn't want to continue that mining conference. If the mining community want it, then I'll certainly be very happy to facilitate that, and also explore other themes related to mining security through that process. In terms of day-to-day levels, and for example, on a very practical level, a lot of my reporting to the Australian government on the security situation in relation to the coup in Mali earlier on, but also political and security developments right across the region, is informed by the Australian mining people who are working in the region, who we communicate with probably almost daily. Through a range of channels. WhatsApp is very popular over here as a way to communicate. So we actually provide them with the information we have, and they also often provide us with a lot of on-the-ground assessments that we wouldn't otherwise be able to benefit from. So, look, I should actually say I did make a little recorded address. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to play that yet, but in that I really acknowledged and thanked the Australian mining industry for the role that they've played during COVID over here. Actually, the mining sector was one of the first sectors over here to sort of turn back on after COVID hit. Actually, in addition to making the first comeback, it's already contributing significantly to employment and government revenue streams to help with COVID. And will definitely contribute to the long-term recovery. And then also on a very practical level, a number of the charter flights that were organised carried Australian citizens out of the region, Australians who wanted to get home. So Australian mining companies really helped us out to get citizens out of the region. So we really thank them for that too.
Gregory, thank you very much. There's a million questions we could ask you about the current situation with Australian expats getting in and out of Ghana and the wider West African region in the mining sector. And I'm sure, again, I'm sure that our delegates could ask you questions offline as well. Hopefully you're available for that, and we'll come back to you very shortly as well. Alison, can I turn to you quickly now, because most of the world has been consumed by one presidential election. But of course, on your patch there, you're non-resident High Commissioner to Tanzania, and there's been an election. In fact, we've just watched our panel discussion a few moments ago, and we didn't have final results from the presidential elections in Tanzania, but now we do. What is the situation in Tanzania now? Can the international community be satisfied that there's a President Magufuli has been returned, and there's going to be a policy of encouraging new foreign investment, or is the situation we've seen earlier in his presidency of clashing with international mining investors going to continue?
Dominic and everyone, I've got some interruptions with the system, so I hope I got the question, obviously relating to Tanzania and the current political situation. So I hope you can all hear me without it freezing. Look, the matter of Tanzanian politics is a matter for Tanzanians. What I can say, though, of course, is that the election has happened. President Magufuli obviously took the win and is being actually sworn in today as we speak in Dodoma, having taken a majority win in the election. Obviously there are some issues that we're monitoring in terms of the reaction of the opposition and the reaction around possible protests. So we're keeping a close eye on that. In terms of attitudes to foreign investment going forward, I could simply say that I hope that things will go forward for foreign investors, and the government will be open to dialogue and really see the place that foreign investors have, of course, including very importantly in the mining sector. That they really do need that support from the mining sector to contribute to the economic recovery and growth going forward. So I hope for the best in terms of dialogue and action going forward with the government now that it is being sworn in with President Magufuli today.
Thanks, Alison. That's a very positive comment. Ian, I'm just going to ask you a question. Well, in fact, we've got a question from the floor. Hopefully, we can ask you, Ian.
Hi, it's Greg Hull, a blast from the past, and you've all made me very homesick for Africa, ex-Senior Trade Commissioner Africa. Look, of course, our mining investment have been flag bearers, and we know that, but they tend to, of course, be limited to a single jurisdiction. They do pull through METs, and as Ian pointed out in the presentation, with education. So we do get a bit of a pull-through effect. But generally speaking, with the exception perhaps of South Africa or Nigeria, there are no sort of scale markets in Africa. And to get other industries interested in Africa, we really need a sort of a trans-Africa, or at least a multi-market approach. And sort of that leads to help them sort of lower their risk and to increase their return. And therefore, to do that, they really need to be able to move across the markets relatively easier than they can at the moment, and certainly, say, relative to ASEAN or Middle East. So therefore, I'm looking at what can, with our tremendous trade policy and trade promotion expertise and advocacy, how can we help the African continent really enhance and speed up their moves to economic communities that would help trade across the boundaries far more easily, and therefore make it an more attractive continent for our exporters and to a lesser extent investors.
Ian, can I hand that over to you to begin with?
Yes, thanks, Dominic, and thanks very much for the question. I think it's a very relevant one. So what we're starting to see, really the sub-Sahara region, so I talk about Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, is becoming a bit of a gateway for organisations that might initially set themselves up in UAE. And I'm seeing a few organisations that have initially set themselves up in UAE, expanded out to the GCC, and then moved more broadly across into Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria. And that's why we've established a contract, a NILink in Lagos. And we've had a few recent success stories, whether that be in health, food, as well as we continue to work on from an education perspective. So it's not all markets, and I think that's the sort of point you're making as well. But I think we have had some good success stories in a number of sectors that traditionally haven't been strong. And we know from a food perspective that tariffs and non-tariff barriers are still a challenge for Australian exporters into Africa. I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. So therefore, how can we help with ag tech companies in improving agricultural production? But I do think there's certainly opportunities in some of these other sectors that historically we wouldn't have been involved in, but again, being selective in certain markets where we've got a presence with DFAT, so Austrade have a presence in Kenya and in Accra, and now with NILink in Lagos, I think we can identify the partners that we need to secure to help Australian exporters enter those markets and be aware of some of the challenges as well. And I think over time, I've sort of mentioned we're already dealing with about new clients. We've got about 16 new clients that we've been talking to who are looking at Africa. So I think over time it's going to continue to build. And I also think, as I said in my remarks earlier on, that I think many more companies are now this is Australian exporters, are looking beyond the traditional markets of Asia. And the recent trade challenges that are going on, I think is just going to amplify that situation, that many Australian exporters need to be thinking more broadly. And that footprint of or gateway of coming through the GCC into Africa, I think is going to prove beneficial, apart from sort of direct into Africa. The gateway, I think, is now becoming a proven model.
Thanks, Ian. Kate, asking you here there in Port Louis, we had your counterpart in Canberra speak yesterday in a panel discussion with a number of the African HOMs in Canberra, and I had a couple of comments after her presentation and after yours as well, just previously, worried about how an Australian company can use Mauritius as a gateway to Africa, and in particular, what are the pitfalls that an Australian company should look out for when using Mauritius as a gateway to Africa?
Thanks, Dominic. Look, I think the key pitfall, and I mentioned it in my pre-record, was that there is this financial action task force process underway. So really to put it very bluntly, there are concerns around the transparency of the financial system here. So the government knows that, they know that they need to fix that. But I guess that the pitfall right now is Mauritius itself. I think once that process is worked through and it's resolved, my advice would be the same as it would be to any company looking to work in another country, that you need to have good local partners, have good local lawyers who can advise you on the local legal frameworks. But I think there's no getting around that huge pitfall right now, that the financial system doesn't have the transparency it needs to operate here.
Thanks, Kate. Well, we've actually run out of questions. It might be a record in the history of Africa Down Under. Maybe people are feeling guilty about getting you to work at lunchtime in each of your jurisdictions. But thank you so much for joining us, both Alison, Ian in Dubai, Gregory in Accra, and Kate in Port Louis. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, as I said at the start of the session, such a tumultuous week in geopolitics around the world. And I'm sure we've still got another day of Africa, even though it's 6:10 here in Western Australia. And might I point out that the Africa Down Under Cup is just about to finish down at Langley Park. And so there's lots of football still to go, so we need to get down there as well. But such a tumultuous week in geopolitics, but we've still got another day to go. So hopefully each of you will be online tomorrow and can participate in the conference again tomorrow. If any of our delegates, whether here in Perth or internationally on the virtual platform, can ask you any questions or approach you, I'm sure you're available. And thank you very much for your time today and your time previously, and hopefully we'll get to see each other again this time next year, or at least in September next year. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks very much. Bye.
Thanks, Dominic. Okay, bye-bye. All the best.